There was a barn situated just beyond the town of Philippi, in what folks back then still referred to as the western counties of Virginia. Inside that barn, on the morning of June 3rd, 1861, a young man by the name of James Edward Hanger was searching for his horse. He was 18 years of age. He had left his studies at Washington College 2 days earlier, on the 1st of June, to ride alongside his brothers and 4 of his cousins as part of the Churchville Cavalry. He had been a soldier for merely a day and a half. Little did he know, but in roughly 3 minutes, he would go down in history as the first amputee of the American Civil War. Rain had been falling steadily all through the night. The roads leading into Philippi were nothing but wet clay. Because of the fall weather, the Confederate pickets had been called back from their posts. The entire town lay fast asleep at 4 in the morning when the Union artillery positioned on the hills above suddenly opened fire. The very first sound that reached James Hanger's ears was canister shot. It is a noise for which no civilian has a ready name. It resembles a giant scattering handfuls of nails across a tin roof. He dashed for the stable. Most of the other Confederates ran in the opposite direction, fleeing out the back of the town, a retreat that the northern papers later dubbed the Philippi races. James Hanger ran for his horse because that was simply what a cavalryman did. He made it inside the stable. His hand was resting on the stall partition. There were 6 layers of 2-inch thick oak planks standing between him and the open ground outside. Then the 3rd Union volley came in, this time a solid shot, a 6-pound iron ball. That ball tore through all 6 layers of oak. It went through them as if they were made of paper. It punched a hole through a 7th layer, where its momentum finally failed. It dropped into the stall. By the time it came to a stop, it had taken James Hanger's left leg clean off above the knee. He did not lose consciousness. That is the detail that always catches me. He was a sharp-minded boy with an engineer's way of thinking, and he watched what had happened to him with a kind of stunned detachment, the way a man might watch a barn catch fire. He could see his foot. He could see that the foot was no longer where it belonged. He could not yet feel any pain, which he later described as the most peculiar sensation of all, because he understood that the agony was on its way and that he was being given a brief moment of grace to brace himself for it. He crawled across the dirt floor of the stable. He pulled himself up into the hayloft, using only his arms and whatever remained of his good leg. He lay there in the hay, while the war he had volunteered for just 2 days earlier swept past him in the darkness. He was discovered hours afterward by Union soldiers from the 16th Ohio. The surgeon of that regiment, a man named Dr. James D. Robinson, was brought to him, accompanied by a second surgeon, Dr. George W. New of the 7th Indiana. They looked at the boy lying in the hay, and they arrived at a decision that hundreds of thousands of similar decisions would be made across the next 4 years of conflict. They determined that the leg had to come off. They took it off above the knee. They used a saw. They used ether. They used whatever practice they had, which on June 3, 1861, was practically none, because no one on either side of this war had any real practice at all yet. When James Hanger woke up, he had a stump where his leg used to be. He was a prisoner of war. He was a Confederate boy in a federal hospital, staring at his own uncertain future. And he was the very first. He would certainly not be the last. Across 4 years of warfare, the surgeons of the United States and the surgeons of the Confederate States together would amputate the arms and legs of soldiers approximately 60,000 times. 3 out of every 4 surgical procedures performed during that war was an amputation. Roughly 70% of all combat wounds According to the official figures preserved in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, were to the arms and the legs 60,000. Let that number sink in for a moment. That represents more amputated American limbs than the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam combined, by a substantial margin. And here is the question I find myself turning over endlessly. The men holding the saws were not the drunken butchers of popular legend. Most of them were educated American physicians. They used anesthesia in nearly every instance. They were not cruel men. So why did decent men, again and again, in good light and in bad, choose to take the saw to a soldier's limb, rather than make an effort to preserve it? What is the darker reasoning beneath that decision? Because it is not the one most people assume it is. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. The city, the state, the country. Whether you came back from your own war and carry something invisible to everyone else. Whether you are a son or a grandson of a man who returned from a conflict missing something. Whether you are simply a man sitting quietly at the end of a long day and wanted a story tonight, put it in the comments. I read every single one of them. I do not skip any. If you are new to this channel, take the next 2 seconds and subscribe. It costs you nothing. It signals to the platform operators that this kind of narrative has an audience, and that ensures these stories continue to be told. We do not pursue the sanitized version of the past that encourages you to click and forget. We tell the tales that the textbooks cleaned up or misrepresented or omitted entirely. The ones with real names, real dates, real people doing their utmost with whatever they had at hand. This story is one of those. Tonight, we are going to spend time inside the surgical tents of the Civil War. We are going to examine the bullet that put more American men under the saw than any bullet before or since. We are going to encounter 4 men by name. 2 Confederate surgeons, 1 Confederate boy who lost a limb before the war, was even a week old, and 1 Union surgeon performing his duties in the dark. And by the end, we are going to circle back to a moral question that has lingered in this country for 160 years. Why did the legs come off? And what is the price of being too slow? Stay with me. There is more here than the textbook ever revealed to you. Let me set the stage for you. The popular memory of Civil War amputation is the one that has persisted in books and old films since roughly 1870. The image is this: a drunken butcher in a stained apron, a dull saw, a soldier biting on a bullet, no chloroform. The saw going in, the scream, the discarded limb tossed onto a pile. It is a compelling image. It is also incorrect. Nearly every amputation performed during the American Civil War was done under either ether or chloroform. The Union Army, according to its own official records, used anesthesia in more than 80,000 operations across the 4 years of the conflict. The Confederate Army, which kept less meticulous records and had fewer resources of every kind, used anesthesia just as extensively until the very last months of the war. The drunken butcher notion took hold because the surgeons worked quickly and the wounds were ghastly, and because some survivors who lived to pen memoirs wrote them in the voice of broken men who needed a target for their blame. It made for better drama to blame the surgeon than to blame the bullet. The truth is more difficult. The men with the saws were striving to keep their patients alive within a medical system that did not yet possess the vocabulary to describe what was actually killing them. So, let me pose the question to you again, a little more broadly. By the end of the war, the surgeons of both armies had performed about 60,000 amputations. About 3 out of every 4 surgical procedures was an amputation. Confederate surgeons, by the middle of the war, could remove a leg below the knee in under 6 minutes. Some could accomplish it in 2. They had practiced extensively. They had become proficient at it. Why? Why did they need to be so proficient? Why did the legs keep coming off? To answer that, you have to begin where the wound itself began. You have to look at the bullet. Then you have to consider the calendar. Because the calendar was the second greatest killer in this war. And most people are unaware of that. Then you have to address a concept that did not yet exist in 1861, which is the notion that the surgeon's own hands might be carrying the very thing that was killing the patient on the table. And then you have to turn to a small brass inhaler, no larger than a biscuit, invented by a doctor in Charleston, South Carolina, who never intended for any of this to happen. His name was Julian John Chisholm. He was born in Charleston on April 16, 1830. He had graduated from the Medical College of the state of South Carolina at the age of 20. He had traveled abroad to London and to Paris to study with the finest surgeons in the world. He had returned to Charleston and been appointed professor of surgery at the very same medical college that had educated him. He was 31 years old when the war erupted, and he was, by any honest assessment, probably the finest surgeon south of Philadelphia. In the summer of 1859, 2 years before Fort Sumter, Julian Chisholm traveled to Italy. He went to observe a war being waged between France and Austria in the fields and villages of Lombardy. The conflict was called the Second War of Italian Independence. He went because he had a suspicion that the next war he would witness would be his own. He watched the surgeons laboring behind the Italian lines. He took detailed notes. He returned home. In the summer of 1861, just weeks after James Hanger lost his leg at Philippi, Dr. Julian Chisholm published in Richmond a book titled A Manual of Military Surgery for the Use of Surgeons in the Confederate Army. It was 447 pages in length. It went through 3 editions during the war. It was the most widely used surgical handbook in the South. It was dedicated to Dr. Samuel Preston Moore, the Confederate Surgeon General, the man in Richmond who would struggle with diminishing supplies and a tightening blockade to keep the entire Southern medical service operational for 4 years. The manual that Chisholm wrote did not instruct Confederate surgeons to perform more amputations. It endeavored, quite strenuously, to tell them to perform fewer. It opened with a lengthy argument that the coming conflict would be the worst any of them had ever witnessed, and that the temptation in such a war would be to cut quickly and frequently, and that they had to resist that temptation wherever possible. They had to make an effort to save the limb first. They should only remove it when the bone was destroyed, the artery was severed, or the wound was already becoming infected. Julian Chisholm wanted to see fewer arms and legs lost in the war that was approaching. They would be lost by the tens of thousands regardless. And by the middle of 1863, he understood that he had no alternative. None of them had any alternative. There was something in the field, in the air, and in the surgeon's own hands that the manual had not anticipated, something none of them could perceive. Let me illustrate what it was. The bullet that wounded more American men than any other in our history was named for a French army captain named Claude Etienne. Born in Paris in 1814, he never fired one in anger. He was a designer, not a combat soldier. And the bullet that bears his name was a refinement of an earlier French design by a man named Henry Delvin. The bullet itself was small, roughly the size of a man's thumbnail. It was cast from soft lead in a mold with a hollow conical base. When the rifle was fired, the gas from the burning powder expanded into that hollow base and pushed the soft lead outward against the rifling. The spiral grooves cut into the inside of the barrel. Those grooves imparted spin to the bullet. The spin gave it a range and accuracy that no smoothbore musket on Earth had ever approached. A trained man with a Springfield Model 1861 rifle could place a Minié ball into a target the size of a man's chest at 400 yards. With a bit of luck, he could do it at 500. That altered everything. Before the Minié ball, the standard infantry weapon was a smoothbore musket firing a round lead ball. The effective range was about 80 yards. Beyond that distance, a man could stand in the open with a reasonable expectation that any ball that struck him would not break a bone. The round balls were slow. They tended to lodge beneath the skin. They could be cut out. The bones, more often than not, held firm. The Minié ball did not allow the bones to hold. The reason lies in the softness of the lead and the velocity of the bullet. When a Minié ball struck a man's femur or tibia at 300 yards, the soft lead flattened upon impact. It expanded inside the wound. It shattered the bone not into 2 pieces, but into 10 or 20 fragments. Those bone fragments, propelled by the bullet's energy, became secondary projectiles themselves. They tore through muscle and artery on their way out. They drove fragments of infected fabric from the soldier's wool trousers deep into the tissue. The wound that the Minié ball produced in a man's leg was not the kind of injury that any surgeon in the world had been trained to treat. There was no bone left to set, Dr. Julian Chisonarian Verchisholm wrote in the second edition of his manual that the rifle bullet had introduced a class of wound that the surgeon must learn to recognize at first sight. He wrote that a limb struck by a Minié ball in the main body of the bone was a limb that the surgeon was not going to be able to save. He could attempt it. He could pack it with lint and pray. But the soldier was going to die of sepsis in 9 days, if not 7. And the surgeon would be left with the same corpse and a wasted week. So the saw came out, not because the surgeon wanted it to, but because the bullet had already made the decision. The second killer was the calendar. A surgeon working in 1863 on a man wounded earlier that day had a window of opportunity. That window was roughly 48 hours. Within that window, an amputation performed skillfully, with the artery tied off, the bone sawed cleanly, and the flap of skin folded over the stump and stitched, gave the soldier a genuine chance of survival. Outside that window, the same amputation performed by the same surgeon would kill him. The statistics are contained in the official medical history of the war, compiled after the conflict by the United States Surgeon General's Office. An amputation performed within 48 hours of the wound had a survival rate 2 to 3 times higher than one performed after that point. The difference was not the technique. The difference was infection. Within the first 2 days, the wound was merely contaminated. After the second day, the wound was actively infected. The bacteria, for which nobody yet had a name, were already established in the tissue. The surgeon who cut into that tissue, even if he cut flawlessly, was cutting into a man whose body was already losing the battle. That is why Civil War amputations appear so swift to us now. They were fast because they had to be. The wounded arrived by the hundreds following a major engagement. The surgeons had 2 days. They labored through the night by lantern light, by torchlight, by the glow of the cookhouse fires. They removed limbs at a rate that horrified the onlookers who witnessed it. They were not racing one another. They were racing the calendar. There is a line in a letter from a Union surgeon written after the 3rd day at Gettysburg that stays with you. He wrote home about working for 60 hours with perhaps 4 hours of interrupted sleep in between. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing here, because the exact wording is longer, that the men arriving now were the ones he could no longer save, and that he could see it in their faces before he even examined the wound. He meant they were past the window. He meant the calendar had reached them first. A slow surgeon in 1863 was a more lethal surgeon than a quick one. That sentence is difficult for a modern listener to process, because everything in our contemporary experience tells us that careful is safer than fast. In a war fought without antisepsis, with a bullet that shattered bone against an infection that nobody understood, careful killed the patient. The fast man saved lives. That was the arithmetic of the surgical tent. That is why the manual Julian Chisholm published in Richmond, the manual he had hoped would slow the saws down, ended up training a generation of surgeons to move them faster. There was a third killer in the surgical tent. This one is the most difficult to discuss because it had no name yet. In 1863, the year of Gettysburg, the year of Chancellorsville, the year of Vicksburg, no doctor in the United States or anywhere else knew that an unwashed hand could kill a patient. The germ theory of disease did not exist in any form that a battlefield surgeon would have recognized. Louis Pasteur was working in France on the fermentation of wine. Joseph Lister in Scotland had not yet published the paper on antiseptic surgery that would transform every operating room in the Western world. That paper was written in 1867. The American Civil War ended in 1865. The men in the surgical tents were 2 years too early. So they did what they had been taught. They washed their instruments in cold water between patients, if they washed them at all. They wiped the saw on a rag. They wore the same coat from morning to morning. The same coat that, after a long day's work, was stiff with dried blood. They pushed the same probe into the wound of one man that they had pushed into the wound of another. And they had no inkling that they were the ones carrying the deadly agent from one body to the next. There is a phrase you will find in nearly every surgeon's notebook from that war on both sides. Hospital gangrene, Minié septicemia, erysipelas. The names varied slightly. The thing they were naming was the same. It was infection in a body that had been opened by a hand that had been carrying it. A wound that produced a thick, creamy discharge in the days following surgery was referred to by some doctors of that period as laudable pus. The word laudable means worthy of praise. The thinking before Pasteur was that the discharge indicated the body was expelling the poison. We know now that the discharge meant the body was being consumed from within. I want to be careful here. I do not want you to walk away from this believing that the surgeons of the Civil War were ignorant men. They were not. They were as well trained as any physicians in America at that time. They read every journal they could obtain. They instructed one another in the field. Dr. Chisholm in Charleston, Dr. Moore in Richmond, Dr. Jonathan Letterman with the Army of the Potomac. All of them worked themselves to exhaustion, trying to improve the survival rates of the men under their care. They did not have the microscope. That was the only tool they lacked, and it was the one they needed most. The darker reason the limbs came off, the reason beneath the bullet and beneath the calendar, was that the surgeons of the Civil War were practicing medicine on the wrong side of a line that had not yet been drawn. 2 years on the wrong side of it. They were the last generation of American doctors to operate in the dark. If you are still with me, leave the name of the town where you are watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story is traveling. Let me bring you back to Julian Chisholm in Charleston. Because by the spring of 1863, he had a problem that the Union surgeons did not share. The Union blockade was taking effect. By 1863, the Confederate Medical Bureau in Richmond was running dangerously short of almost everything. Quinine was scarce. Morphia was scarce. Chloroform, the anesthetic that allowed a surgeon to cut without the patient screaming, was the scarcest of all. Every barrel of chloroform that made it past the Federal cruisers was a barrel that a blockade runner had risked his ship and his life to bring in. The Union Army used a standard chloroform technique that wasted most of the dose. The chloroform was poured onto a folded cloth. The cloth was held in a cone over the patient's face by an assistant, and most of the vapor dissipated into the air of the tent. The federal practice used something like 2.5 ounces of chloroform per patient. The Confederate Medical Bureau could not afford 2.5 ounces of chloroform per patient. So, Dr. Chisholm built a smaller device. The Chisholm inhaler was a small brass apparatus perforated like a pepper shaker, about the size of a large biscuit. It fitted over the patient's nose. The chloroform was dripped in measured drops onto a sponge inside the device. The patient breathed it in through the device. The dose was about 1/8 of an ounce per patient, 1/20 of the Union dose. Scarcity had forced precision. Chisholm had constructed the first true Confederate anesthetic delivery system, and he had built it because his nation was running out of the medicine that allowed a surgeon to work. There is a point about scarcity I want to raise. Scarcity is generally supposed to make things worse. In Confederate medicine, in the case of chloroform, it made things better. The Chisholm inhaler was a genuine improvement on the Union method. It delivered a controlled dose. It put the patient under more quickly. It used less of the precious substance. After the war, American surgeons from both sides examined the Chisholm inhaler and acknowledged it as a true piece of engineering. The kind of device that would have been developed earlier, if anyone in 19th century medicine had thought to develop it. A Confederate doctor working under blockade had built a better tool because he had no other choice. The Confederate surgical tents in 1863 and 1864 frequently had fewer instruments than the Union tents, fewer assistants, fewer lanterns, less of every consumable item a surgeon required. The surgeons compensated by becoming faster. The 6-minute amputation, the 2-minute amputation. The work performed by lantern light at 3 a.m. was the work of men who understood that the next wounded soldier was already on his way, and that there were 50 more behind him. On the night of May 2nd, 1863, in a Virginia tangle of second-growth woods that the locals called the Wilderness, a Confederate general named Thomas Jonathan Jackson was riding back through his own lines after a reconnaissance mission. His own men, who could not see him clearly in the dark, mistook the riders for Union cavalry and opened fire. 3 bullets struck Stonewall Jackson, 1 in the right hand, 2 in the left arm. The arm bones were shattered as his litter bearers carried him toward the rear. One of them stumbled in the darkness, and Jackson hit the ground hard on his broken left arm. By the time he reached the field hospital, he had lost a significant amount of blood, and the artery in the arm had been damaged. The hospital was situated at a place called the Wilderness Tavern, about 4 miles from where he had been shot. It was not really a tavern anymore. It was a tented hospital under the care of Dr. Harvey Black of the 4th Virginia. Black had a tent prepared, a bed inside, blankets warmed over a stove. Jackson was carried in. His personal physician was a 27-year-old surgeon from Winchester, Virginia, named Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire. McGuire had been with Jackson since the first months of the war. He was the chief surgeon of Jackson's corps. He had amputated General Richard Ewell's leg the previous August at Groveton. He was, by May 2, 1863, one of the most experienced battlefield surgeons in the Confederate Army. He examined Jackson's left arm. He consulted with Dr. Black. They both recognized what had to happen. The bone was shattered and the artery was damaged. The wound was already 2 hours old. The window was closing. McGuire informed Jackson of what he had to do. Jackson replied, "Do for me whatever you think best." At approximately 2 in the morning of May 3, 1863, by the light of a lantern held by Jackson's aide, James P. Smith, with Dr. Robert Coleman administering the chloroform and Dr. Black monitoring the pulse, Hunter Holmes McGuire amputated the left arm of Stonewall Jackson 3 inches below the shoulder. It took him under an hour. The arm was wrapped in a blanket and set outside the tent. Jackson's chaplain, a man named Beverly Tucker Lacey, did not want the arm thrown into the pit with the other amputated limbs. He retrieved it. He carried it about a mile to his brother's farm at a place called Elwood. He buried it there in a family plot and placed a stone marker over it. Stonewall Jackson did not die from the amputation. The amputation was a cleanly performed procedure. Jackson died 8 days later at a small house at Minié Station of pneumonia that developed while he was recovering from the surgery. His last words, his secretary later recorded, were about crossing over the river and resting under the shade of the trees. There is a stone today at Elwood Manor in Spotsylvania County that marks the grave of an arm. I keep returning to that stone. Hunter Holmes McGuire was 27 years old. The most famous patient of his life had just been carried into his tent in the middle of the night. He had under an hour to decide. He chose to cut. He chose to be swift. He chose, in other words, exactly what Julian Chisholm's manual had instructed him to choose when the bone was destroyed. He saved the arm, in a sense. He saved it from a slower death. He could not save the man. That is what the choice looked like. Every time the saw came out, even when the patient was a general, even when the surgeon was the finest in his corps, there was a soldier on the table. He was 18 years old, like James Hanger, or 26, like the average enlisted man on either side, or 39, like Stonewall Jackson. You had a wound. You had a window. You had what you understood about that wound, which was that the bone was gone, the artery was leaking. The soldier had been struck at 300 yards by a Minié ball, and that in 72 hours he would be dead of an infection you could not see and lacked the vocabulary to describe. You had a choice. You could try to save the limb. You could clean it as best you could, pack it with lint, splint it, and hope. About 1 time in 3. With that approach, the soldier would survive and keep his leg. About 2 times in 3, he would die slowly of sepsis in a bed that another wounded man could have used. Or you could remove the limb. You could amputate swiftly. About 3 times in 4, with a clean amputation performed within the window, the soldier would live. He would lose the leg. He would go home on crutches or on a peg or eventually on a wooden leg with a hinge in it. But he would go home. The surgeon had 10 minutes. Sometimes he had 2. He had a tent full of men behind the one on his table, all bleeding, all running their own calendars. He had what Dr. Chisholm had written in his manual, which was, in plain terms, that the first duty of the military surgeon was not to save the limb. It was to save the soldier. You can look at that arithmetic and call it cold. You would be right. It was cold. The men holding the saws recognized that it was cold. They wrote about it after the war in their memoirs in tones that should not be mistaken for pride. Dr. Jonathan Letterman of the Army of the Potomac, after Antietam, defended his surgeons against the newspapers that had characterized their work as butchery. He pointed out that the man on the table was not a textbook case. He was a soldier who had to live, if he was going to live at all by tonight. The decision to take the limb was not made by villains. It was made by exhausted men in poor lighting with too many patients, under a microscope that did not yet exist, holding instruments they could not yet sterilize. It was made the way the bullet had compelled them to make it. And it was made in the same manner, on both sides of the line. The Confederate surgeon at Chickamauga, the Union surgeon at Gettysburg, the regimental doctor at Shiloh, all of them, north and south, looked at the same wound, and arrived at the same conclusion. The Minié ball did not care which uniform the man on the table was wearing. The calendar did not care. The infection, when it came, did not care. That is the darkest part of this entire story. The decision was rational. It was honest. It was compassionate in the only way that a battlefield surgeon could afford to be compassionate. Here is what I would like you to understand before we conclude this. The popular memory of Civil War amputation, the drunken butcher, and the dull saw, and the man biting on a bullet is incorrect in almost every detail except one. It is wrong about the saw, which was generally clean enough by the standards of its time. It is wrong about the surgeon, who was usually sober and frequently operating on 3 hours of interrupted sleep. It is wrong about the anesthesia, which was almost always available in some form on both sides until the very final months of the war. It is wrong about the cruelty, because the cruelty was not in the men. The one thing the popular memory gets correct is the scale. There truly were piles of limbs outside the field hospitals after major battles. The diaries of nurses mention them. Surgeons mention them as well. After 3 days at Gettysburg, behind one of the federal field hospitals at the George Spangler Farm, the arms and legs had to be carted away in wheelbarrows. They were buried in long trenches. Some of those trenches were dug up years later by farmers plowing their fields. But the limbs were not on the ground because the surgeons were monsters. They were on the ground because the bullet had outpaced the medicine, because Pasteur had not yet been read, because Lister had not yet published, because chloroform was being rationed through Dr. Chisholm's brass inhaler, and lantern oil was running low, and the next wounded boy was already being carried in by the time the first one was carried out. And the calendar would not pause for anyone. The darker reason beneath the saw, the reason that has nothing to do with cruelty, is this. The surgeons of the American Civil War were operating in the final hour before the dawn of modern medicine. 2 years later, they would have had antisepsis. 5 years later, they would have had purified ether and standardized anesthetic dosages. 50 years later, they would have had blood transfusions, X-ray plates, antibiotics. They were a generation of educated men working at the very frontier of what their century knew. And what their century knew was insufficient. That is why the legs came off, because the men on the tables had no other honest path to survival. I want to leave you with one image. It is a quiet one. In the autumn of 1861, in a federal hospital outside Philippi, a Confederate boy named James Edward Hanger lay in a bed with the stump of his left leg healing beneath a bandage. The Union surgeons had done what they could. Dr. Robinson had provided the boy with a wooden leg, the kind that was standard in 1861, which was a peg, a solid block of wood, no hinge, no knee, no ankle, the kind of leg a sailor might have worn in 1830. James Hanger despised it. He was an engineering student. He could see with his engineer's eye that the leg was flawed. There was no joint at the knee. The peg could not bend. The body of a walking man bends at the knee with every step, and the peg, by refusing to bend, was forcing him to walk in a way the human body was not designed to walk. He could feel the incorrect shape of it through the muscles of his hip and his back. He was sent home that August on a prisoner exchange to his family's house in Churchville, Virginia. He went up to his upstairs bedroom and closed the door and remained there for 3 months. His family did not know what he was doing. They assumed he was grieving. They tried not to disturb him. He was not grieving. He was building. He took apart old oak barrel staves from his family's cooperative shed. He carved a shaft. He carved a foot. He crafted hinges into the knee and into the ankle. Hinges that bent when the muscles of the upper leg instructed them to bend. He used metal scrap, a few pieces of rubber, and the discipline of an engineering student. In November 1861, he came back down the stairs of his family's house walking, not on a peg, but on a hind leg that bent at the knee and the ankle, that swung naturally when he walked, that the eye from across a room would not have recognized as wood. It was the first articulated artificial leg, manufactured in the United States, that functioned the way a leg functions. He patented it under the name the hanger limb. The first man to wear one outside his own household was another Confederate veteran, then another, then dozens, then thousands. The Confederate state governments funded those legs. Virginia appropriated prosthetic funds for its veterans in 1866. North Carolina did the same. So did Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina. The cost was enormous. They paid it, because in the years after the war, 1 in 5 of the men who returned home to the southern states had lost a limb. By the time James Edward Hanger died in 1919, he had built the largest prosthetic limb company in the world. It is still in operation today. It is called Hanger Incorporated. It supplies more artificial limbs to American veterans than any other company. The young men in Walter Reed today, the soldiers who returned from Iraq and Afghanistan without their legs, walk on the descendants of the limb that James Hanger carved in his bedroom in the autumn of 1861. The first amputee of the Civil War became the man who made it possible for the last amputees of every American war since to walk. That is not nothing. They came home, those men, in numbers we have never really come to terms with as a nation. About 60,000 amputations, the records state. About 1 in 5 Confederate veterans came home with a sleeve pinned up, a trouser leg folded over, or a hinge at the knee that needed oiling. The men sat on porches in the long evenings, and they did not always speak of what they had witnessed. The wives and the sons and the daughters sometimes spent 50 years trying to fathom the silence. There is a photograph, if you search for it, of a Union sergeant named Alfred A. Stratton of New York. He was wounded at Petersburg in the summer of 1864. He lost both arms above the elbow. He was 20 years old. He came home and taught himself to write with a pen held in his teeth. He learned to feed himself. He lived another 10 years. The photograph shows a young man looking at the camera, with both sleeves pinned up. His face has not yet decided whether what happened to him is the worst thing that will ever happen to him, or the thing that will define his survival. He died in 1874. There is also, in a glass case at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, an early hanger leg from the 1860s. The oak is dark with age now. The leather straps are darker. You can see, on the hinge, at the knee, the wear pattern from a hand that gripped it repeatedly over many years. Some Confederate veteran whose name we do not know took that leg on and off every morning and every night for the rest of his life. The wood is smooth where his hand rested. I think about that hand sometimes. I think about the fact that the leg under glass was made by another amputee who understood, because he had borne the same wound himself, exactly what the leg needed to do. That is the grace note I want you to take with you tonight. This was not a story of monsters. There were no monsters in this story. The Union surgeon who took James Hanger's leg in a borrowed kitchen in Philippi in June of 1861 was doing what he had to do, and he was doing it as well as the medicine of his century permitted. Dr. Hunter McGuire, at 2 in the morning at the Wilderness Tavern, was doing what he had to do. Dr. Julian Chisholm in Charleston was doing what he had to do. The Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Preston, more in his office in Richmond, working under a blockade that was strangling his bureau, was doing what he had to do. The Federal Medical Director, Dr. Jonathan Letterman with the Army of the Potomac, was doing what he had to do. They were not monsters. They were not heroes either. They were doctors and patients in a war that had outstripped their medicine. And they were there. They were there in the surgical tents, in the rain, by lantern light, with the calendar pressing in and the bullet still doing what it had been designed to do. 60,000 limbs came off. About 1 in 4 of those men died regardless. About 3 in 4 walked home. One of those who walked home was James Edward Hanger, who refused his Yankee leg and built a better one. He once said, looking back on June 3, 1861, that he was thankful for what had seemed at the time nothing but a cruel trick of fate. He meant the cannonball. He meant the loss of the leg. He meant the morning in the hayloft. The story we tell about that war in this country is still being contested. It will probably be argued over for as long as the nation endures. I am not going to argue it for you tonight. I am only going to tell you that the men in those tents were men, and that they were there, and that they did the best they could with the bullet, and the calendar, and the microscope they did not possess. If this story resonated with you, do me a favor. Share it with a man who needs to hear it. Pass it along to a son or a grandson. Leave a comment again with the name of the town where you are watching tonight. I will read every one. The next story we are going to tell is the story of a Union actress named Pauline Cushman, who in the spring of 1863 was captured by Confederate cavalry in Middle Tennessee and sentenced to hang for spying. She was 30 years old.